Welcome to the Untold Civil War. And today we're going to be airing the first of hopefully many installments of a new series I'm doing on Civil War myth busting. I'm doing these with good friend of the show and personal role model of mine, Detective Robert Girardi. Today's episode is going to be on Gouverneur Warren, but before we dive into that, I've got to thank my sponsors. Number one, I'd like to thank the badge maker, who's actually provided me with these stickers that are on my laptop. You can get your own by visiting the link in the description, and there not only will you be able to get stickers, but you'll be able to get all the sorts of different Civil War replicas and reproductions. I also like to thank Civil War Trails. So when you're planning your next vacation, you definitely want to use the link in the description to get access to the greatest outdoor museum in the United States. And now, let's dive into our episode. We are starting a segment on Civil War myth busting. I think this is going to be a series that we've been talking about doing, and this is going to be episode 1 of that series. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be talking about those commonly retold myths and tear them apart, thus turning your understanding of the Civil War upside down. I'm pretty sure these episodes might bring some tears to some. I'm not sure, but let's kick it off. So I think today we're going to be talking about Gouverneur Warren, who you're actually writing a book on, right?
Correct.
So what are some of the myths about Gouverneur Warren?
Okay, well, excuse me. I think first we got, if anybody doesn't know who Gouverneur Kendall Warren is.
Right, yeah.
1850 graduate of West Point, number 2 in his class, assigned to the Corps of Engineers, does a phenomenal job of mapping the Dakota territories prior to the Civil War. Early on in the war, he's Lieutenant Colonel of the 5th New York, Darius Zouaves. Basically, he's commanding the unit for its duration. He fights at Big Bethel, goes to Baltimore, builds Fort Federal Hill, goes back to the peninsula, gets adopted by McClellan, fights through some small battles, makes his way up to Brigadier General, becomes Joe Hooker's chief engineer during the Chancellorsville campaign. He actually maps the wilderness and creates the Corps badges with Dan Butterfield. Goes to Gettysburg as chief engineer. Mead, General Mead, wants him to be his chief of staff. Warren declines because he wants a combat command. After Gettysburg, he leads the 2nd Corps in Hancock's absence. He's the hero of Little Round Top. His monument on Little Round Top is probably one of the most recognized. So this is Warren. In 1864, after the reorganization of the Army of the Potomac, Warren is given command of the 5th Army Corps. He is the junior corps commander in the Army of the Potomac, ranked by John Sedgwick, who's got the 6th Corps, Winfield Scott Hancock, who's now back in command of the 2nd Corps. Warren's got the 5th Corps. The 1st and 3rd Corps are dissolved and absorbed into those 3. Ambrose Burnside comes back, having formerly commanded the Army of the Potomac. He's now in command of the 9th Corps, but he can't be subservient to Meade because he outranks him. And the 11th and 12th Corps have been sent west, consolidated into the new 20th Corps. They fought at Chattanooga, and now they're in the Atlanta campaign with Sherman as the 20th Army Corps under Joe Hooker. So Warren is one of the 3 guys in the Army of the Potomac, and he is Meade's guy. He's an engineer like Meade, so that they work in lockstep. First day of the Battle of the Wilderness, Warren's guys find Confederates where they're not supposed to be because the cavalry hasn't done its job properly screening, and Warren is ordered to attack without regard to dispositions. What does that mean? Pay no attention. Just go forward blindly and attack and let the chips fall where they may. He protests, all his division commanders protest. Finally, he goes forward, and if you've been to the wilderness at Saunders Field, one of the few openings in that battlefield, some of his guys get slaughtered. There's bad blood. There's allegations made that Warren has now fallen in the esteem of Meade and Grant because he's reluctant to attack and he's not obeying orders right away. And so they stick that cautious label on. Warren is a cautious general. Later on, that's going to be a recurring theme. Open up any book and you're going to see that in the paragraph that they give you the little footnote biography, and that's going to be one of, no matter what the facts are, you're going to find that cautious word there. It's one of his fatal flaws. Leapfrog, after the Wilderness, May 8th, 1864, the 5th Corps under Warren is given the all-important job of marching from the Wilderness to Spotsylvania Crossroads. Warren is supposed to take that crossroads. That puts the Army of the Potomac between the Army of Northern Virginia and Richmond. It's a key element of the strategy. And here's this cautious general who's just lost the esteem of Grant and Meade, supposedly, who's given this all-important job. His men march through the night. They get to Todd's Tavern, where Federal cavalry is blocking the road. And they get delayed. Leapfrog several hours later, as Warren's lead elements are making their way to Laurel Hill at the crossroads, thinking they're only fighting Confederate cavalry, the leading elements of the Army of Northern Virginia under Richard Heron Anderson are arriving and taking position. And so Warren's men are not fighting cavalry that they think they can brush off. They're fighting veteran Confederate infantry. And Warren, aware of the importance of taking it, does something completely uncharacteristic for himself. He throws his men as they come up. Some of his brigade and division commanders say, look, our men are winded. Go forward. He even leads a charge with the Maryland Brigade, taking their flag and charging the breastworks himself. That's the morning. Now comes the afternoon. And here's one of these myths, if you believe James Harrison Wilson, who writes this in 1912 in his book, Under the Old Flag. Warren is going to be, after several unsustained, unsupported attacks against this increasingly stronger Confederate position, Warren is ordered to make yet another attack, this time in cooperation with Sedgwick's 6th Corps, which still is not on the field. According to James Harrison Wilson, I can read it from the book, or I'll just summarize it for you. According to James Harrison Wilson, Warren, who, because of his familiarity in working with Meade and the working relationship they've had for a year, says to Meade, I won't cooperate with General Sedgwick. You're the commander of this army. And if you give me an order to attack and you tell General Sedgwick, if you put Sedgwick under my command, we'll attack and he'll obey my orders. Or if you put me under his attack, under his command, we'll attack and I'll obey his orders. But I'll be goddamned if I'll cooperate with General Sedgwick or anyone else. And that's supposed to show Warren as this combative, feisty, unscrupulous commander who only cares about himself. One historian does a great book on the whole campaign, says that Warren is insubordinate here. Nobody bothers to do the homework, though. James Harris, and then Wilson goes on to write that when Warren told him this later on in confidence, and they were West Point classmates, by the way, class of 1850, but there's never any indication that there was ever a friendship between them. Warren says to him, Wilson told Warren that you're lucky that, me didn't do anything to you. If I was in command, I would have had you up on charges for insubordination. And Warren supposedly said to him, oh, I wish you had, because then it would have spared me all the suffering I endured after his relief at the Battle of Five Forks. Well, James Harrison Wilson writes this account in 1912. Warren is long dead. Meade is long dead. Many other people who could have been there are long dead. It's the first time this story appears. Now, in Warren's papers, in his correspondence with people, in Meade's papers, in Andrew Humphrey's papers, in Washington Roebling's reports, in Theodore Lyman, who's Meade's staff officer. Roebling is Warren's staff officer, later brother-in-law. Humphreys was Warren's pre-Civil War boss, and now the chief of staff of the Army of the Potomac under Meade. Meade, Humphreys, and Warren were called by one general the engineers cabal in the Army of the Potomac. and Charles Wainwright, the artillery chief of the Fifth Corps, and these are the primary sources on the Army of the Potomac during this campaign: Lyman, Roebling, Mead, Humphreys. Not one of these people mentioned any such incident at any time during the war, during the campaign, because it didn't happen. But National Park historians walking you through the wilderness or at Spotsylvania will tell you this story. A recent book that came out has the authors saying that Warren sends this dispatch to Meade declaring, "I will not cooperate." Well, even in his imaginary creation of the story, Wilson says that Warren says it face to face with Meade. There is no dispatch for something that didn't happen. It wasn't added after the fact. It's just not there. This is an apocryphal story that was invented after the fact to try to show, to characterize those fatal flaws of Warren that are then used to justify what was done to him at Five Forks the following year. See, look, this was building up. This guy, you just couldn't work with him. He thought he was in charge. He wouldn't follow orders. He wouldn't do anything that wasn't his way. You know, the cautious, everything has to be lined up. Everything has to be this way. It's got to be his way or the highway. And that's just not the case. This is just one of those instances. And of course, it's written that nobody can refute it because they're all dead. Right. It's always nice to be the guy that has the last word.
This goes back to some things I've mentioned in previous videos, and I think on previous episodes on the podcast, is that when you read these primary accounts, primary sources, they're important, but also take everything with a grain of salt. Well, and it's also key when you read these things, you have to know, why is this person writing this? Is there, what's behind it? What is his motivations? What's the goal here? And I think this is a clear example of where you have to really read between the lines and know what's going on around everything besides just that one account.
There's more to the story. So, I mean, as in your career, that when you interview people, who they are, what they're telling you, why are they telling you it? Maybe they're telling you the truth. Maybe they honestly believe what they're telling you, and maybe it is true. But just take a car crash. There's two people that are involved in the car crash. You get two different stories from them, and the guy that's sitting in the cafe looking out the window at the intersection that sees the crash. Now you got three accounts of what happened. Which one's telling the truth? Well, all of them to a degree, none of them to a degree, but the truth usually goes one way or the other. It's closer to one story or the other, especially if you think you're at fault. Now, interestingly, they were West Point classmates, and they did do some work together, like in the Illinois area on the Mississippi River after the Civil War, Wilson and Warren. So sometime after the war, could Warren have said something like this to Wilson? Yeah, maybe, but they weren't friends. There's no correspondence between them, like, hey, dude, what are you doing on the weekend? Kind of thing going on. It's just not happening. But on that first day of the Battle of the Wilderness, when Warren's Fifth Corps is waking up and finding Confederates, the picketing screen was supposed to be conducted by James Harrison Wilson's cavalry. Wilson had never commanded cavalry before. He was one of the few engineer officers in the Western Theater that Grant brought east with him when he grabbed Sheridan to give Sheridan command of the cavalry. He gave Wilson a cavalry command under Sheridan, and Wilson didn't do his job. And there'll be bad blood between Warren and Sheridan from Todd's Tavern till after Five Forks because of what happens and doesn't happen at Todd's Tavern. So there is some background there that doesn't usually make it into the assessment of this. Well, here's Warren, and this is an example of his personality and why you just couldn't work with him. Now, interestingly, reinforcing this, and I'm not sure what year, I think it was in the late 1880s, that Horace Porter, Grant's staff officer, writes his memoir, Campaigning with Grant. Now, when the Time Life Collector's Library came out, the blue leather books with the gilt-edged pages, the premier volume, couldn't wait to get it, Campaigning with Grant by Horace Porter. Fabulous book. During the Spotsylvania section of the book, Porter writes that Grant is impressed with Warren from having interviewed him in Culpeper before the campaign opens. And Grant thought that if something was to happen to Meade, Warren would be the guy that he would look to replace Meade in command of the Army of the Potomac. Okay, maybe. Would Lincoln have given Grant his way that early? Maybe. But Lincoln kiboshed Grant's plan to go after Mobile Bay and some other things in favor of Red River campaign and some other things. So Lincoln wasn't just giving Grant carte blanche like he would do a year later, maybe. But just think about it logically. Why is not the Ninth Corps under Ambrose Burnside under George Meade's command? Why do orders to the Ninth Corps have to go through Grant to Burnside and not from Meade as the commander of the Army of the Potomac? That bizarre command situation is in place because Burnside outranked Meade because he had previously commanded the Army of the Potomac. Well, if Warren, who is junior to Meade, Hancock, Sedgwick, and Burnside, is placed in command of the Army of the Potomac, you think Sedgwick and Hancock would have something to say about that? You think Burnside would have something to say about that? It would totally disrupt the command structure, and you'd have to replace not only an Army commander, but probably 4 Corps commanders, because somebody would have to replace Warren. So it just doesn't make any sense. But it's accepted, it's put forth, and it's used as evidence against Warren when they assassinate his character in every book on the Civil War that you read. But nobody went to the source and said, does this make sense? I mean, the one thing that you know as a police officer is no matter how bizarre something is when you get there, there's a reason for it. It might not be a good reason, but there's a reason. And usually, if you understand the reason from the point of view of the person who did whatever they did, it makes sense. It might be crazy, but it makes sense in the crazy world, right?
Right.
This doesn't even meet that standard. It doesn't make sense.
And one thing I think people who may not understand is that military role, the role of rank and structure in the military, how strict it is. I think people don't really grasp that. And that's why, Grant had to go all these ways with Burnside, because there's a strict structure that it's not that simple. You can't just, move people around like that,
That's right. And it's actually used many times. When John Pope is brought from the west to the east in the summer of 1862, he's placed over, they create the Army of Virginia Union that is going to be commanded by John Pope, and Irvin McDowell and Franz Sigel and John Charles Fremont are supposed to be the corps commanders. Well, Fremont ranked Pope in Missouri, and there's no way he's going to be subservient to him, which Lincoln knew. Exit Mr. Fremont for all time. He put himself in a position where I can't serve under a previous subordinate, so I'm done. And Lincoln said, thank you for your service, go away, and please don't bother me anymore. Franz Sigel, the same thing. Irvin McDowell stayed. Nathaniel Banks took over one of those command positions and actually complicated the campaign by biting off more than he could chew at Cedar Mountain. But that's just one example of using that to get rid of somebody. In the Atlanta campaign, in later that summer, I forget the exact date, but when it had to be in July when James McPherson is killed at the Battle of Atlanta. Instead of giving John Logan the command of the Army of Tennessee, the Army of the Tennessee, instead of giving it to John Logan, Sherman gives it to Oliver Otis Howard. Well, guess what? Leading the 20th Corps is a guy named Joe Hooker. If you look at Chancellorsville, Hooker, to his dying day, believes that, Howard is the reason why the debacle at Chancellorsville unfolded the way it did. Hooker is not going to stand there and let a junior who he has no respect for take command of an army that he's the next in line to command, and he doesn't get it. So he resigns. That was manipulated that way. So why, if that's the culture in the Army everywhere, is it not going to be the culture of the Army of the Potomac when it's war? If it applies to everybody else, isn't it going to apply to him as well? Isn't that just logical? But nobody ever questions the logic, ever.
Right. And I think we even talked about it too. It was at the beginning of the war as well, when Irvin McDowell was chosen, right? Didn't that ruffle a bunch of feathers, including General Scott, because he said that McDowell, he had worked with them before, but he was not the senior officer. I mean,
No,
Scott wanted Halleck, Scott wanted Lee. But McDowell was definitely not on the list because he was just not senior.
Right. So it's not until now when there's an exception to that, and it's not to say that there aren't exceptions, and it's not to say that Lincoln wouldn't have granted it to Grant like he did to Meade when Hooker's relieved before Gettysburg and Meade is chosen. Meade is given explicit orders that you can give any position to anybody regardless of rank, and that actually comes into play at Gettysburg on day one, when Hancock arrives on the field and Oliver Howard is there organizing the retreat through the town and trying to craft a defense on Cemetery Ridge. And Hancock shows up and says, "I'm in charge here." And Howard says, "No, you're not," because at that point, Hancock is the junior corps commander in the Army of the Potomac. He had just been made after Chancellorsville. So late May, early June, he becomes commander of the Second Corps because Darius Couch resigns, vowing never to serve under Hooker again. So Couch absence, Hancock replaces. He's the junior corps commander. Now he's giving orders to a guy who is senior to him, not by a whole lot, but is still senior to him. But he pulls his magic piece of paper out of his pocket that says, "Meade gave me permission, so and in charge." And then he just basically rubber stamps a lot of what Howard has already done. But these kind of instances on a field of battle show you that what's happening outside of combat with just, well, here's my pecking order, it's just not going to fly. It doesn't make sense. And it's made up. And Porter's Grant's guy. And a lot of Grant's guys after the war in their writings go out of their way to take pot shots at Gouverneur Kimball Warren, who gets relieved without cause at Five Forks, and then they try to justify it. So open up any book at random you have on your shelf there about any of these campaigns where the name of Warren comes up, and you'll read little comments of, recognized by everybody as the smartest man in the room, but he had fatal flaws. He always questioned his orders. He was cautious. He was this, he was that. And all of that is like, if this guy is such a pain in the butt, if he's so hard to work with, if he's so much in your way, get rid of him. But they don't. They never do until right at the very end. And it's only under special circumstances where that's put into effect. But here's a guy that if he's so problematic, why do you keep giving him independent commands and independent actions like at the Weldon Railroad or Jarrett Station or some of these other forays he sent on? And not all of them are successful, but nobody's always successful. But Warren usually does a good job. And that's the reason you give it to him.
Right, right. And basically, I mean, you're now writing this book on Warren. Hopefully it's coming out very soon. And when it does,
if I ever finish my revisions, which I'm working on diligently.
Fantastic. And we're definitely going to have to bring you back on and talk about the book. And I got to get a signed copy.
Oh, absolutely.
So I think
even if you trash it, just buy it. I don't care if you even read it. Just
Well, it's very important that this book is coming out to address these myths. And I guess just in closing off, you've kind of addressed it a little bit already. But can we address sort of the so what? So why is it important to dispel these myths about Warren, and what does it do to give us a better understanding of the war itself?
Well, I think when you look at these campaigns, understanding the command structure, and we talked last time about some of the relationships, the personality conflicts that affected the outcomes of campaigns, and actually how unprofessional that is. But we're talking about human beings, and so it's going to happen. But I think if we want to understand some of the thing, why are these people in the position that they're in? Number one, why are they allowed or not allowed to do certain things? And what's the underlying reasons for that? Now, if you start out with bad information, like a garbage in, garbage out, right? So if you start out with a false assumption and you ignore correctable evidence, if you will, that'll allow you to go down the right road instead of the wrong road, and you ignore it, shame on you. None of this material is new. There's no like smoking gun. Oh, well, why wasn't I informed? It's always been there. But people are predisposed. If Grant wrote it, if Grant's guys wrote it, they won the war. All power to them. We'll just go on what they said without checking it. And there's been some recent scholarship that actually challenges Grant, not only in his methodology, what Grant butchered this, whatever, all of that, but his veracity. Is he credible as a source? And why is he given carte blanche? Why is it the gospel according to Grant? And why don't we challenge some of these things that are demonstrably false? And as historians, as a reader, I want to read something and believe what I'm reading is true. If I have doubts, I want to be able to go to the sources and see maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm not understanding this. But when I see contrary evidence, and you know that as a police officer, I knew it as a detective, just because I think this doesn't make it so. When everything else is pointing this way, guess what? You know what? Maybe I should look that way and see what everybody else sees that I'm missing. Maybe they're right and I'm wrong. As unbelievable as that may be, many times that's the case. And so then you get down to the final thing. The man who shot Liberty Valance. When the legend becomes a fact, print the legend. Well, yeah, okay. I talked to one guy. I don't remember the exact incident, or I would cite it. But the historian, the author said, well, I know this story isn't true, but it's such a good story, I put it in the book anyway. What? What? And so I think we have a duty, not maybe so much as a consumer of history, but as an author, as somebody that knows how to sort through evidence. I have an obligation to get the story right, no matter where it goes. I mean, it may show, you know what, these guys are all right. Warren was a weasel. I mean, this BDI, one description is BDI staff officer was a overcautious micromanager or something. It's like, what? Okay, you're entitled to your opinion, no matter how wrong you are, but don't put it down as history. And that's where I think we go. I love The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance as a movie. I disagree with the last line in the movie.
Right. No, I think you hit the nail on the head. We're coming to be about that time right now. I just wanted to say thank you so much for coming on the show, shedding some light on that. Very important. And one thing I'd like to say, I'll put your website in the description below, and I'm going to encourage everybody, if you have a Civil War roundtable, a historical society on campus, the New York Civil War Society, Mike Connors, I'm looking at you, get this guy to come to New York. Please go to his site and email him. Really personable, very easy to get in contact with you. So thank you so much for coming on the show. I appreciate it.
My pleasure as always.